kind of got this particular project at this particular time rolling was our efforts here at King TV saying we need to update our plan. We had a plan in 1995, it was a stack of papers, but we were in a different location, a different building, and it was a different situation in terms of what we thought we confronted then. In the wake of that, I mean, it's like a lot of plans, okay, everything's great, put it on the shelf and we need it, let's go back and get it. The reality is that like a lot of things kind of, you get busy, you do other stuff, you don't maintain it. So when we moved down here into the Soto area, we're right across from Safeco Field, we're in a different building. We moved here about a year and a half ago now. We're frankly, on top of the Seattle Fault. We're vulnerable to tsunamis here potentially. And so we said, you know what, we have several missions here. One is when we have an earthquake, keep our employees safe, try to keep the business going, and our other important role, try to cover the news.
Yeah.
Other businesses can take some time off till they figure it off. This is going to be the biggest news story that any of us are ever involved with.
And what I think is interesting is that yesterday we got a little bit of pushback, I'll be honest with you guys. We got some pushback from people who said, what's the big deal? Why are you blowing this out of proportion? And I think what's interesting about this, Glenn, is the more research that you did, the more that you realize that we really do have to be prepared, because it's not a matter of if these are going to happen, it's a matter of when they will happen. Statistically, it might not happen for years from now, but the idea is that when it does happen, we all have to be prepared. So you and Karina did a story in preparation for this to kind of answer that question. How big is the threat that we're facing?
Yes, so anyway, Karina and I talked a few weeks ago. We've seen her quite a bit on our air. She's now here in person, but let's show you the first half of that piece that we produced the other day.
Okay, we're off.
Geologist.
I was in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and I lived about 5 miles from the epicenter.
San Francisco was much further away, where freeways collapsed, along with houses. 67 died. It took years to recover.
After the main quake stopped, we got out of the loft and were trying to get out of the house. And then the first aftershock came and it knocked our bookshelf over and almost flattened us. And then we had to climb over that. And then the next aftershock came and knocked all the glass out of our shelves onto the floor.
From personal terror to professional resolve, it motivates her to save lives here in Washington. The following risks are the top 3.
We're looking at the Cascadia subduction zone, the ground shaking. You can see it goes all the way across the state. There will be low shaking in Spokane, and then a tsunami that follows. Seattle fault zone, located in the Seattle basin, multiple faults, intense shaking around the fault radiating outwards.
South Whidbey.
This is the southern Whidbey Island fault in between Everett and Seattle, intense shaking around the fault radiating outwards.
They range from a magnitude 9 in the Cascadia subduction zone down to a magnitude 7 on the Seattle fault. But let's back up for a second to that magnitude 9, the big one off the coast.
We know a bit about it, but we don't know enough about it, and it poses risk to so many people from Canada, Washington, Oregon, California.
It's been 300 years since the last big one, January 26th, the year 1700, and evidence still stands. These trees died when the powerful quake caused lowland on the coast to drop, allowing seawater to come in and kill the trees. We saw this scenario happen just 6 years ago in Japan, the 9.1 Tohoku earthquake. Not only shook, but led to a massive tsunami which overwhelmed a much more prepared Japan. Tsunami walls proved too low. 16,000 people died. The geological processes that resulted in that quake are at work today, right now, this second. It's called plate tectonics. Because crustal plates that make up the ocean floor are stuck, locked to the North American plate that makes up western Washington. When the pressure becomes too great, those plates slip, forcing the ocean plate to be shoved below or subducted under the coast. Not just the shaking, but the fault distorts the ocean floor as it slips, triggering the tsunami. And not only that, but it's the length of the fault that will give us a quake expected to last 5 or more minutes, running from Cape Mendocino, California, to north of Vancouver Island, Canada. Quakes that happen on average every 250 years, meaning the next one could come any time, or decades from now.
So we're just talking about the three threats that we were talking about. We had a hard time seeing it actually here in the studio, though you saw it in the phone, which is Cascadia Subduction Zone, the Seattle Fault, where we are now, South Whidbey Island Fault. But that's not really it. It doesn't stop there.
No, there's a number of other faults, the Tacoma Fault. We have faults in eastern Washington, all across the Cascades, the St. Helens Seismic Zone. There's a number of threats and earthquakes that could cause damage all across Washington.
And the bottom line here, in where we closed this out with you the other day, is that more research needs to be done, because we don't know everything. You guys have not gotten it all figured out.
Absolutely not. And as we develop new technology like LIDAR, light detection and ranging, we're able to see through the trees, and we can see fault scarps that tell us where these faults come to the surface, and that really helps us understand these faults. And then we can pick locations where we can dig and trench these fault systems, and that helps us to understand the recurrence interval and when these faults have slipped in the past, and that helps us to get a better estimate of when they might slip in the future and what we can expect. When are we due for the next one?
So let's talk a little bit about what you guys do, because you're a geologist, Bill is a seismologist. People go, ologist, schmologist, what's the difference? Explain that. Where do you fit in and where does he take over?
Yeah, so as a geologist, we look at the rocks, the ground under your feet. And so we're out there with our rock hammers and our compass and our GPS, and we are mapping. We're seeing what types of rocks are where, and we identify faults in the field, and then we provide that information on our website and in different publications for people to go and check out and understand the rocks and the geology. And we also study I'm a hazards geologist, so I study volcanoes and tsunamis and earthquakes, but more the geological aspect of it. And Bill?
Well, I'm more of a hazard seismologist, if you will. So seismology uses the energy that earthquakes produce to help image structure deep in the earth, to image shallow structure. We can have active sources where we can do little explosions or bang on a drum and be able to image very shallow things in the crust using seismology. And we can even image the shape of the inner core of the earth using earthquakes from around the world to arriving at different places. So seismology is a very broad field. My interest is where the impacts of earthquakes on society and people.
So Bill, when it comes to planning for earthquakes, what does the average person need to know about where the threat is and how it could express itself?
You know, that's a great question, because we don't know what earthquake is going to hit us next. We know the most probable earthquake is a deep Benioff zone earthquake similar to Nisqually, but it could be right under Seattle. It could be larger. It certainly could shake harder, as it did
Less
in
than a
1949.
minute, and this is what we
so
saw.
that is our mom and apple pie. There's like an 84% chance that we're going to see that in the next 50 years again. And you know, most youngsters here will have a couple of these in their lifetime to deal with.
So when you talk about that, the most likely scenario, what kind of damage could we see from that earthquake?
So we saw what the Nisqually earthquake produced. It could be significantly worse if it's a larger magnitude. That was kind of a threshold event. You know, things were breaking, particularly in Olympia and in areas where the ground motion was amplified by soft soils, etc. But in general, it wasn't quite strong enough or quite long enough duration to really damage general structures in Seattle, and Tacoma actually was in a kind of a shadow. The way the rupture broke, it kind of protected Tacoma from strong ground motion, so it didn't see very much. So we were very lucky. We're very lucky with that earthquake. The next one is likely to be worse. But that's kind of the mildest of the sources that we have as far as damage potential, because being so deep in the earth, the intensity of shaking moderates as it moves up to the surface. So you lose some of the high acceleration, high frequency energy as those waves move up. So a crustal earthquake, when you're nearby the fault, will be much more intense, much more violent shaking, and will damage even some well-built structures.
This is one of the questions that I really have for you. Bill, you've been involved with the public outreach for decades.
Yeah.
From Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, which is at the UW, which is looking at seismometers and seismicity. You're the folks that will be putting out the warnings. You'll be putting out the information. As a chief hazards geologist for also, which is under Department of Natural Resources, you are also in the public outreach piece of this as well, which is why we wanted you here. And what we got in terms of our feedback yesterday, we were sort of looking at the numbers, and I think 80% of the people were pretty positive about trying to either I'm ready, I'm sort of ready, I'm interested in getting ready, to 20% that were going, bah humbug, there's nothing here to see. Obviously there is. I mean, the science is not in question here. We just saw this same phenomenon 6 years ago in Japan that killed 16,000 people. When you go out and you talk to folks and you talk to groups and you're approached for your information, what do you say to folks? What kinds of stuff sort of surprises you? What would you like to see more of?
I like to think of it, most people drive and you go out and you're in your car and everyone has a spare tire. You're prepared to get a flat in case that happens. Does it happen on a daily basis? No. Does it happen yearly? Hopefully not. You know, it happens a couple times in 10 years maybe, but you have the tire just in case you get the flat. And so being prepared for an earthquake is similar to that. You want to have the tools in your car, in your house, to make sure that you're able to withstand anything that happens. And that includes making sure your bookshelves are fastened to the wall. When I was in an earthquake when I was younger in California, my bookshelf fell and it almost knocked me over. The TV fell off the stand. All the glasses fell out of the cabinet. So just simple, inexpensive things that you can do in your home can really help to protect you and your family. And it's up to you as a citizen to be prepared for such an event.
But I think part of this, because it's here and folks who went through Nisqually say, well, I've been through a big earthquake before in Western Washington. Not true. You've been through an earthquake, not necessarily a big earthquake. And then you have the fact that where California has a major event every couple of decades. You're reminded. But coming from California, now you're in Washington, the geological system here is different.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it is similar, but much of it is different, much more prolonged, yet the threat is actually greater at the end, north of Cape Mendocino, past Oregon, here into Canada.
From the Cascade, yeah.
So do people seem to, in your vision, do you find a broader disconnect in the years you've been up here than you did in California?
I think a lot of people, having not experienced a significant earthquake, are not aware of the risk they face and what that would feel like and what they can do and to be prepared. And so because we don't have these small events on a regular basis, we grow complacent and we don't prepare.
Are we complacent, or Bill, is it too abstract for most folks?
Yeah, I think that might be that's a good point, Glenn. I think we're not wired as human beings to work well with long-term hazards. I mean, anything from the climate to earthquakes to whatever else. If it's a long-term problem, our immediate need of making dinner and getting the kids into school and paying the mortgage and getting the bills paid kind of dominate our mind. And if it's more abstract, like it may not happen for decades, we tend to just push it out of our mind completely and do nothing and deal with the things that are in front of our face. It's part of being human. So we almost have to trick ourselves a little bit to say, okay, I know this is a problem. I know it's long term, and not just for the earthquake, but for the windstorm, for the power outage, for this ice storm that's going to hit. I'm going to have my home and my family ready so that we can be safe in our house. We can shelter in place for weeks if need be, and be fine. And if you make it kind of look at it that way, make that a challenge, and set things up that way in the way we do our normal daily lives, then it can be a fun thing. It's not a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. If you're just joining us on the platforms of King 5, we have University of Washington seismologist Bill Steele, and we have Karina Forson with the Washington Geological Survey. She's the chief hazard geologist. We're talking about how to prepare for the big earthquakes. And I want to encourage you at home, if you've got a question, go ahead and post the question on the King 5 Facebook page, and we'll get the questions, as many as we can. I want to go right into some of your questions. Jason asks, what are infrastructure vulnerabilities? So Bill, in the scenario of the big earthquake, what is going to fall down? What is it going to look like here in Seattle?
Well, it's going to be a mixed bag. There are things that are going to be damaged and some things that it depends on the type of earthquake if you want to be exact, but for really strong shaking earthquake like on the Seattle fault or long duration earthquake like in the Cascadia subduction zone, we would expect unreinforced masonry buildings to show a lot of damage and some collapse. And they, of course, spread their bricks and debris over a pretty wide area, can close streets and block navigation. We're going to see some bridges fail, at least be unsafe to be on, and they're going to have to be inspected and repaired, and some maybe, pretty badly. But others will hold up well. Okay, so you're going to have a mixed bag where you have soft soil liquefaction occurring, which is when the ground, with sandy soil with a high water table, the sand tries to compact or compress, and the water doesn't compress well. And so it sort of suspends the sand and the ground behaves like a viscous liquid as opposed to a solid, and it can flow out toward an open face. That can really undermine foundations and separate bridge abutments and do a lot of things that cause big problems for structures. But so it's going to be a mixed bag. Your neighborhood is probably going to look a lot like it does today. There are going to be some toppled chimneys, there may be some wires down, there are going to be some things wrong. Certainly those darn car alarms are going to be sounding off everywhere. But your neighbors are going to be there, and you're going to be there, your family's going to be there. So it's how you prepare now to be able to ride through the aftermath of that earthquake will depend on how well your family does.
But if you look out there, you're looking at you both are, but you're looking at the entire state.
Right.
And the problem gets worse depending on the nature of the earthquake. It's going to get on this subduction zone earthquake, which is the one thing we can sort of quasi-predict in the sense we know the interval. It's going to get worse as you go west.
Yeah, and then as you get closer to the coast and along the Strait of Juan de Fuca and even in the Puget Sound, you have the tsunami inundation. So where after the earthquake you have a tsunami wave that follows, and some places only have 20 minutes between the time of the shaking and the tsunami, whereas other locations have an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes to try and evacuate up to high ground. So we like to tell people to make sure, for a tsunami, the shaking, the earthquake is your warning. So
Right.
drop cover and hold on for the earthquake, protect yourself from the shaking, and then once the shaking stops, evacuate to high ground as soon as possible, and preferably on foot.
Do you feel like these tsunami zones are clearly identified and people have drilled for this stuff so far in Washington?
It depends where you go. The communities are doing a fantastic job of getting prepared, and the communities that are at risk are really taking charge and trying to work with the people that live there, the people that work there, the tourists that visit there, to provide them with information about where tsunami inundation will be and how to evacuate safely. It's a challenging problem how to convey that information to people. Some people think it will frighten them and that they won't want to visit their town. And so it's a balance to try and educate people and also welcome them to the community and just know that the chances of you being able to survive this are very high, but be aware of your surroundings and know where to go in case you feel the earthquake.
So what about the city of Seattle? Could we see a tsunami come through here?
Absolutely. Well, not through the entire city, not in the high ground, but we will be affected by a tsunami from Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, but it will be dissipated tremendously, and we'll have a lot of lead time before that tsunami arrives. But in a worst case scenario, it could affect as much as 2 meters, a meter or 2 meters in Elliott Bay from that kind of tsunami. However, that's not the only source. The lifting of the seafloor is not the only tsunami source possible after a big subduction zone earthquake. We have a big pile of sediment at the mouth of the Duwamish River, and if you had a big landslide, submarine landslide of that shaken loose by the long duration ground motion, that could amplify a tsunami in and of itself. Or if you had a big landslide into deep water from the bluffs that go down into the sound, that can generate a wave as well, which is a tsunami.
We have a graphic that you brought along. Hopefully we can post that right here where you get a sense for just how deep the water could be. And we're talking about a range.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We don't really know. So if I mean, it's not as simple as saying there's a 7.0 and that means here on First Avenue it's going to be 6 feet deep.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have some wonderful scientists that work on modeling tsunamis for different earthquake sources at UW and at NOAA, the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab. And they model a bunch of different sources. So the Cascadia source, we can rupture the entire length from Northern California to Canada, and that can produce a tsunami that has a large you have a large earthquake that produces a massive tsunami, or you can rupture pieces of the subduction zone, and those produce different tsunamis. And so we have a geologic record of all of these different scenarios, and so understanding what is the next event going to be is very complicated. So we like to provide information, kind of what is the maximum extent of tsunami inundation. So it's sort of a worst case scenario. And so we can identify where you need to go, because at the time when the earthquake happens, you won't know if it's just the northern rupture or the southern rupture or the full rupture. You just know that you need to get out of there.
Right, exactly. Let me talk a little bit about that, because this goes, there was an exercise a year ago. We've been talking about this the last several days. It was in June of 2016 called Cascadia Rising. It involved 23,000 military and civilian personnel.
Yeah.
And what came out of it was this. And I don't know which is the hot camera. We'll let you zoom into that. This is the brochure, and this is all linkable to king5.com/disaster. You'll be able to, you can download this. You can talk to the Washington Military Department, which covers the National Guard, Emergency Management, and get a copy of this yourself. And other things you can do to get ready, which is that card, which involves how you can write your contact down and help get prepared and everything else. The old guidance was you need to be on your own prepared to be on your own for 3 days. The new guidance directly out of that, and talking to Robert Ezell, who's the director of that agency of emergency management, said by day 2 of the 4 main days of the exercise, we knew 3 days was not going to hold up, and 2 weeks needed to be closer. And some places, the more remote you are, the more west you are, just in that scenario, you may be longer before anybody can get you. You see that there are not enough helicopters in the world that can lift enough material to solve this problem. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that yesterday. And one of the places I'd like to go in this conversation, and I think this has frightened a lot of people, and there's a reason to be concerned, and depending on where you live and everything else. But there's also the idea of, can we make this state resistant enough to where the concern about the loss of life, et cetera, is going to be a lot lower. You look at Japan as a much more prepared country. Unfortunately, when it came to the height of the tsunami walls in the Sendai region, it wasn't high enough. But the city of Sendai, the downtown, was high enough to where it was out of the tsunami zone, and Andy Taylor, who is a seismic engineer here, structural engineer, said there was virtually no damage they could find.
That's right.
And you can see that story on king5.com as well. So when you are asked by other state agencies, when you go to conferences and is there a willingness to get the kind of work done so we don't have to worry about the bridges, we don't have to worry about, we can get our unreinforced masonry buildings reinforced?
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't seen that. I mean, I think there's an awareness that, and particularly among engineers, there's a strong awareness that we're in trouble a little bit with our infrastructure and our preparedness. I think there's a real interest to do it, but it costs a lot of money. And unfortunately, our best friend is the building codes, because modern, strong building codes mean at least new structures being built will be able to withstand the kinds of earthquakes likely to occur where they're built. And that helps us. But we have all of these older buildings. And we do need to work, I mean, as a society, I think we need to talk more about that and say, is it acceptable for us to put children in an unreinforced masonry school where you know you're going to have very strong shaking and that building is not going to survive. I mean, is that a moral thing to do?
And I want to segue right over to you because that's a project you're working on.
Yeah, so that's a project, thank you, that's a great segue. So there's a project we're working on to try and get funding to assess schools to understand their seismic risk. So depending on the type of the building, will it withstand the shaking, and what is the geology at each site? And it's part of this larger initiative, Resilient Washington. Kudos to Governor Jay Inslee for helping putting that forward. We're trying to identify what are the major downfalls in this state. We're looking at transportation, we're looking at hospitals, we're looking at school buildings, we're looking at tsunamis, we're looking at community resilience and coming back after an earthquake, and how will we have as little disruption to economics and business planning as possible. And so this is a large group of people from all over the state and all different departments coming together to try and put together a plan to how to make the state more resilient. Unfortunately, as Bill said, it costs a lot of money, and we need legislative support and we need funds to make this possible. So it's a constant kind of battle with the science and what's achievable.
But I think that assessment is a great first step.
It's a wonderful
and
first
once
step.
we understand the breadth of the problem, and we can say, well, maybe we'll be lucky. You know, maybe we have 10 years before that big earthquake. But darn it, let's make a plan to get there in 10 years then, or maybe get there in 15. But we have to start chewing away at this problem, and sticking our head in the sand isn't enough. And that's what we've been doing, frankly.
Well,
I have to jump in here because Phil has a comment. Science is amazing, but warning systems stink. Can our experts discuss? And I was listening to a report probably a week ago that was talking about how the president's proposed budget cuts funding for the early warning system along the West Coast. So the federal government, and it's only like $10 or $12 million to finish it out, and they're proposing cutting that from federal funding. Talk about federal funding and where we are and how crucial it is to the science necessary to be prepared.
I appreciate that. Actually, Congress has been very supportive of the earthquake early warning system from the beginning. And the leadership never really did come from the White House. Even in the Obama administration, they weren't leading with encouraging the build out of the earthquake early warning initially. And now the Trump administration said they have other priorities, fine, but Congress is who really makes the budgets and decides on the spending. And in a bipartisan way, they recognize that the earthquake early warning system has great cost benefit. And it really gives us the first opportunity of getting a little bit ahead of the curve. We're not just waiting for the earthquake to occur to surprise us. There are things that we can pre-wire that can happen when a large enough earthquake occurs nearby that can improve the resilience of a water district, of a sewer system, to protect from release of chlorine gas, so many other
Stop for a minute and
things.
explain, just because if people have not seen this, we did a big project with you a few months ago on earthquake early warning, and we've done pieces periodically, but tell folks what it does.
So our earthquake early warning system called Shake Alert, it very rapidly detects when an earthquake occurs, when the P wave, which is a sound wave traveling faster through rock than sound does through air in a lower frequency, but that sound wave hits our seismic network, it triggers it, and then within 2 seconds we can, using 4 seismometers, locate the earthquake and estimate its magnitude pretty accurately. Based on that, we can estimate how strong the shaking is going to be in Seattle and Tacoma and Everett and your neighborhood, at your factory, your water district, at your dam, and then push an alert out at the speed of light, essentially, that will say in 22 seconds you're going to get an estimated intensity 7 at your facility. So that can then trigger automated actions. It can warn people to get in a safer place. It can do any number of things.
But the P wave doesn't cause damage, but the following S wave, which is slower, is what you're really worried
That's
about.
right, Glenn. Thank you for mentioning that. The P wave travels faster than the shear wave, almost twice as fast. So it's moving out quickly from the source of the earthquake. The shear wave is also moving out, but slower. So it's the P wave that triggers the alerts. Well, by the time the shear wave arrives there, hopefully people are prepared for it, and that's where the real shaking energy is. So the P wave has a lot of information about the source of the earthquake, its magnitude, and we can locate it with it. It's the shear wave we're worried about. So we can get tens of seconds for crustal earthquakes, or maybe only a few if you're very close to the rupture. But even for if you're right above the earthquake, if it's deep enough, like there was a 30-kilometer deep earthquake near Aberdeen earlier this year, and the alert went out before the shear wave reached the surface right above it. So as soon as that P wave hit the surface, it hit enough seismometers that an alert was issued 2 seconds later. It took another 4 seconds for the shear wave to reach the surface. So if you had your alert ready, or the screen up with the early warning system, you would have gotten 4 seconds warning before the shear wave even hit the surface.
But Karina, when you look out there, what can you do with 4 seconds?
You can stop a train, you can drop cover and hold on, you can pull over to the side of the road, you can do quite a few things in 4 seconds that could save your life and the life of others.
And you could get more time, depending on where you are relative to the earthquake.
Yeah, absolutely.
One more question from Johnette asks, does WashDOT have an earthquake plan for the roads? I'm guessing right after an earthquake, you have to do a massive assessment of the entire region, right?
Well, we're already working with WashDOT and have for many years. And there's a new program the USGS is funding. We're also working to get installed with WashDOT. I think they have it now called Shake Cast. But we've been working with them for a long time. We take the ground motion produced by an earthquake, and then we run an algorithm developed by our civil engineering group that pulses every bridge in the state with the intensity of ground shaking that happened where that bridge is. And then because WashDOT gave us fragility information, how strong are these bridges, when were they built, etc., we're able to calculate a probable damage state for every bridge in the state within minutes of the earthquake occurring, and we push that information to WashDOT headquarters, and they can use that to help, where do they need to send their inspectors first, what bridges look like they're fine, and at least initiate a response.
But I don't want to leave people with the impression that nothing is being done. Because having covered this issue for decades, I remember Chuck Ruth was the bridge engineer back in the 90s, and he had, I think it was $7 million a year, which didn't sound like much even back then, to start retrofitting bridges. Just keeping a bridge beam on a simple bridge from sliding off and dropping down, killing people below and even above. We're now seeing the viaduct being replaced. The tunnel is now through. Now it's a matter of finishing the road and the tunnel. The 520 bridge, which was earthquake damaged,
was very vulnerable. That was
very vulnerable. That's now been finished, except for the approaches. That's the next project here.
It's funded, I guess.
It's funded. And as I drive around and I look at different bridges, and now which you sort of know what to look for by working with these engineers, you go, okay, all right, we see the retrofits going in Pioneer Square. The city of Seattle's got a requirement, if you do a major if you do a remodel, you have to bake that in. It's happening. It's happening fast enough will depend on when we get hit with this earthquake. So if we don't get it for 50 years, maybe we'll be ready. If it comes tomorrow, we're in real trouble still.
Well, we'll certainly be more ready. And I think one of the things that I caution people, because I want to be an optimist about this, I think that we can prevent damage from earthquakes, and we can prevent large earthquakes from being big disasters by preparing properly for it and mitigating. But as you mentioned, the initial phase of the retrofitting was keeping the bridge decks on. That's very important, right?
Right.
And in some cases, well, these columns, we know they're very
A lot of
weak and
columns
tend
have
to
been
break.
jacketed,
So
too.
now we're going to jacket some of these columns, and that's very good. But then there's also the bridge-soil interaction. There's a lot of other factors that go into it. So I don't want people to think that because a bridge has been retrofitted, it has improved its performance and it's reduced the probability of a collapse, but it's still not as good as a new bridge. So you're right. I mean, these new structures and the rebuilding of these are really the gold standard. And eventually, we'll get through them all, and we'll have a more modern infrastructure.
Just tonight, we did a piece with Puget Sound Energy on replacing gas mains with new, higher flexible pipe. Not that they don't use this in other parts of the country, but it's going to be a lot better. I mean, they got rid of the old cast iron pipe, but not until the 1990s. It's not that long ago.
Yeah.
And now they're replacing more brittle plastic pipe.
have one more question. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Well, I was
Finish
just
your
going to
thought.
say they've been a great partner too with providing some resources to help fill in gaps in our earthquake early warning network and help us get data back to UW over their network. So they're aware that we have a earthquake problem in the Pacific Northwest, and they're working pretty hard to try to minimize those impacts.
Another question. Laura asks, what about FEMA? Would they help Seattle in a disaster? Glenn, what's the protocol in terms of where help comes and when it comes?
Well, that goes back to Cascadia Rising. So clearly you have Washington Military Department, as we explained, that's the National Guard, that's the Air Guard, that's the Emergency Operations Center, the Emergency Management Division. They will then interface immediately with the federal authorities, and we will start to see assets coming over the passes.
Right.
It will be convoys of trucks, it will be people, and I want to get back to that in a minute, and it will be aircraft and everything else. The issue is not whether there's help. The issue is there enough help? Part of the problem, and we talked about this quite a bit, and you can see this piece on king5.com, is the local responders, be they policemen, firefighters, National Guards people, wherever, are going to be in the same boat. They're going to be trying to take care of their homes, they're going to try to keep the family. And that's where the 2 weeks comes in, is they're not going to be, hey, I'm good tomorrow. Some of those people we probably won't be able to get. They could be injured. And so that's going to really require this out-of-state influx to come into the region, and that's going to take the time. And until, if we lose bridges coming over I-90, if we lose bridges even coming, if we have landslides in the Columbia Gorge, if it comes in the middle of the winter, we could have an avalanche problem. If you look at the 530 landslide, also known as the Oso landslide, and you look, that wiped out a major highway for months before that was put together. Even the Skagit River Bridge collapse, which was not a natural disaster, but where we had a truck that triggered a collapse into the river, created a nightmare for I-5 in that community.
Can I?
Yes,
jump
please.
in? So the FEMA question is a great question, and I just wanted to point out that FEMA is a huge supporter of understanding these risks even before they happen, and they've developed a program called HAZUS, Hazard US, and it helps scientists and emergency planners and county agencies to understand these risks and to plan for what to expect. And so it gives us probabilities for how many people are going to be without water and for how long, what's the estimated fatalities and casualties, what's our economic impact. And they work with geologists and scientists to help understand this so that we can be more prepared ahead of time. And each county goes through this risk plan to identify the risks in each county, and then they work with subject experts to try and be more prepared and try and, if there's a building that's in the flood zone and it's flooded time and time again, and it's also in the earthquake zone and it's also in the volcano zone, well, how can we move this building or get rid of this building because it's, it could cause damage to the structure and to the people who live there or work there. So they're proactive ahead of time as well, which we appreciate.
Daniel has a question. What type of volunteer work is there for people interested in furthering knowledge in emergency preparedness? I'm guessing the volunteer network is critical to all this.
It's incredibly critical, yeah. I recently went to Columbia to learn about volcanic hazards, and they have a huge volunteer network, and it really made me in awe of the power of volunteers. And so you can volunteer with Red Cross, you can volunteer with FEMA, county, all of the counties that you live in, the emergency managers there would love volunteers to help go out and understand. They have a number of problems that they could use volunteers to help solve. So those are some of my ideas.
Yeah, they also have run programs kind of training, helping neighborhoods come together and learn what resources are in everyone's neighborhood and help the neighborhoods get prepared. Yeah. And through your church, through your, there's a variety of different ways that you can contribute to emergency preparedness and management for your area. And that's wonderful if people do that. And then also the ham radio operators often volunteer to help with communications, and we've got a lot of specialties. A lot of people really pitch in and make a huge difference after disaster and before.
I want to cross sort of a T and dot an I here. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that about FEMA, because that data went into the Cascade Rising exercise from the High Track study. And I can't remember what High Track is, but basically that is the organization within FEMA that does the kind of analysis that you just talked about.
And they were focused on critical infrastructure initially, you know, looking at our utilities, our transportation system, the hospitals, you know, what we consider lifelines, if you will. And so, they took a hard look. I mean, they kind of made some assumptions of the worst kind of shaking and the most vulnerability that maybe, I think the damage in that High Track study is the real earthquake will not be that level of damage everywhere. There'll be pockets of it, but some areas will get off a lot lighter because it's not an even distribution of shaking across the Cascadia region. There are areas where there are tightly locked zones that will pop and release a lot of high frequency energy, a lot of stress drop on that break, and then kind of a less slip, you know, as you move up, or a little easier slip, and then another tightly knot thing. So where those asperities, we call them, are those tightly locked zones that break and produce a lot of short period energy, will vary the shaking around the region. So I think it was good to practice that way, because emergency managers saw the worst that they might face in everything except for maybe the tsunami zone. I don't think still we have our arms around how
We do have
how
inundation
bad that
mapping
is.
for that.
We do, which
we
is
do,
great.
but not for the whole state. Is something I'd like to point out. So
Yeah.
that's something that we're working on currently. Again, it's a matter of funds and staff and resources, but we have tsunami inundation modeling for a large portion of the state, and we're working to get there, but we do not have it for the entire state.
Mostly you were showing me some stuff for some inundation in Everett.
Yeah,
when we
we
were at
have-
your office a few weeks ago.
Yeah, we have that. We have it for the major communities along the outer coast that are going to be the most affected, the highest population centers from the Cascadia event. And then we have some Seattle fault scenarios for the Puget Sound as well. But there's a lot more work to be done.
Mostly in the inland waters.
And the outer coast and the whole Strait of Juan de Fuca. We have, we call them postage stamps. And I'd like to just kind of come back to what you were saying and put in a plug. If you're at home and you're wondering, how do I find out like what my shaking will be where I live? How do I know if I'm in a tsunami inundation zone? Our website, dnr.wa.gov/geology, we have a lot of information about geologic hazards, and we even have a portal where you can type in your address and you can turn on different layers for tsunami hazard, for shaking intensity, for liquefaction, and it can show you what we know about the hazards in your area. So that's a really useful tool for people to check out what we know so far.
So Karina, give that web address one more time.
www.dnr.wa.gov and then /geology.
It's a site we use all the time. It's wonderful how they've pulled together all this information and all these papers and all these maps and geologic maps and make them available to everyone. So
Well, we've used
we
it as
encourage
well, and it's incredible. And the fact
Yeah.
that you can click on one thing or all the things, but you can get a lot more clarity rather than having just sort of everything coming at you at once.
Yeah.
I have one more question from Jason. I'd like to see a simulation of a typical home, the impact that a large earthquake would have on a typical home in Seattle. Does Seattle have any sort of simulator? I know when my co-anchor Lori Matsukawa went to Japan, there was a simulator that she went through there that sort of showed people.
Yeah.
Do we have anything like that around
We
here?
don't. There is a kind of a trailer that has hydraulic actuators under it that can sort of simulate an earthquake it's in Southern California or in California that makes visits up here occasionally, and it's kind of interesting and fun to do. I don't think it's at all to the level that the one that Lori was subjected to or got to experience in Kobe. That really was a state-of-the-art one. I worked at UC Berkeley for a number of years in earthquake engineering, and they have a large 20 by 20 foot three-dimensional shake table that you can put models of buildings on and shake them and down, and they're elsewhere in the country as well. They're wonderful, but they're being used for earthquake engineering, not so much for people to experience what an earthquake is like.
Karina, you said that you went through an earthquake and it really made you realize how the things in your home were not secured. You know, when we all have children, we baby-proof the house, right? So that they can't pull the TV over on top of them or a dresser over on top of them. Do we need to go through our homes right now and just look around and maybe anchor things down as if we were baby-proofing?
Yeah, it's a great idea.
so.
But, you know, the shelf, too, in your kitchen, you know, if your cabinets open up and all that glass comes down, those little child-proof latches can be quite useful there. So maybe that's a great thing. Rather than unscrewing them all when Johnny's no longer a toddler, maybe just leave them in place.
But there's the concept of just, you know, people feel, 2 weeks and I got to have 54 gallons of water for my family of 4 and everything else that's too overwhelming. I don't want to deal with it. But the recommendation really is just start doing something. And we've had it in so if you go to your house, I mean yours is probably pretty
It could
pretty
be better,
wired up
yeah.
right now. But what would you recommend people do, at least just in terms of so the books just don't fly off the shelves as they did when you were growing up?
Books are a hard one. So, you know, in your home, make sure that you have the bookshelves bracketed or screwed into the wall. You can go to any home improvement store and buy simple, what are they, L brackets, and you can screw them to the wall and to the bookshelf, and you can't see them, and it doesn't distract from the aesthetics. If you're really concerned, if you have a large bookshelf and you think they could all fall off, you can get like metal cords that you can screw to the ends of the bookshelf to try and keep those in place. We have those in our library to make sure that the books don't fly off. You can, as you said, have some sort of latching device for your cabinets to make sure that those stay in place. One of the things that gets brought up in preparedness and what happened to me when I was in the earthquake is if the glass falls or picture frames fall, there's glass on the floor, and if it happens during the night, you get up and you're barefoot, always keep a pair of shoes under your bed, and that should be your first thing that you put on your shoes so that when you're walking around your house, you can walk around.
You said somebody in your house was
yeah, my babysitter got
you
stepped on
were
a
a
piece
kid.
of glass, and so she couldn't carry my younger brother out, and it was.
But it made a difference. It wasn't just a little cut.
No, it was she gashed her foot open. So, you're not thinking about stepping on glass. You're thinking about getting out, because then there's aftershocks, and then those are also startling. And so it's important to have that in your muscle memory and practice your evacuation and your drop, cover, and hold, because if you don't practice it, you're not going to think, oh, my shoes.
Right.
And so that's something that we encourage.
The instinct is to flee out of the building, and that's usually the worst thing you can do. So we got to kind of think through these things and practice them so that we kind of build some of that muscle memory, and we're not just going by instinct that can get us in big trouble. People run out of buildings and then the bricks fall off of the buildings and crush them. It happens all the time. I mean, most of the casualties in earthquakes are from things falling on people that are leaving buildings or outside of the buildings, not from them collapsing on them inside.
And I wanted to go back to your comment about it's overwhelming to prepare for 2 weeks. I agree. It seems like a lot when you think about it, especially if you have a family of 4 and 2 dogs and having food for 4 people for 2 weeks. How do you do that? And it's expensive to buy that. So we recommend that every time you go grocery shopping, if you go grocery shopping once a week, buy one item that can go in your pantry or your buckets. I use those large Tupperwares, that you store in your garage, and you can have one for week 1 and one for week 2, and you rotate those out, every couple years so that you have food that's fresh enough to eat. And buy canned goods, but make sure you have a can opener. You can buy backpacking food. It's not very good, but it's compact and it's nutritious, and it'll get you through a couple days, and so it doesn't take up all the space that a lot of those canned goods do. And buy stuff that you like to eat, because you don't want to be stuck with just cans of tuna fish for 2 weeks straight. And
you can even put a bottle of wine in the thing.
That would keep too.
Right. That's right. That's
It
right.
could actually get better over time.
Right.
I have to ask, both of you live and eat and breathe and sleep this stuff. Is there a scenario, or is there something about natural disasters, earthquakes, that keeps you up at night? I mean, what's the biggest single thing that troubles you?
That, as you know, we're geologists and scientists, so it's in a way sort of interesting and exciting to learn about the science of it. But what troubles me is that I don't do a good enough job communicating this information to the public and making people aware of, you know, especially for tsunamis, where they need to go and how they can get there. And then with earthquakes, how they could have been more prepared. You know, oh, if I only would have known I should have bolted my bookshelf to the wall, then I wouldn't have broken my leg. You know, it's, you know, simple things that are relatively inexpensive and easy to do, as long as, you know, you have the curiosity and pay attention.
Yeah.
I think that's what,
What about
worries
you?
me.
I think that's great. I also worry about, I guess, the really extreme event, like a really large Seattle fault earthquake, just because the level of shaking that will produce close into the fault, and the fact that it runs right through our downtown and Bellevue, and so many people will be subjected to such extreme shaking. There are going to be casualties, and there are going to be tragedies, and there are going to be things we're not going to be able to put together again right away, and so that's always tough. But then again, there's a lot of positive things too that I'm really encouraged by the energy that so many people are putting in. Volunteer community, people are really interested in our learning about earthquakes and volcanoes and how they can be proactive and keep their families safe living here. We can live with earthquakes and we can live with volcanoes, but we can't do it by ignoring them. So we just need to buck up and as you said, do one thing. Do one thing today, do another thing next week, and pretty soon you're going to find yourself prepared. And if we integrate some of this into the way we do business, and we move furniture around, the first thing we should think about, if it's tall furniture, whatever, is okay, so where do I fasten this one? And just do it then. It's just the way you do business, and you just make a minor change the way you do business, and in a few years your home is safe. Yeah. So that's kind of what we're shooting for. We're just hoping that people learn that it's not that hard, and it can actually be fun too, getting to know your neighbors and having community events in your neighborhood where you learn who's vulnerable and who has talents and tools that are useful.
You were just talking about the Seattle fault. I asked Karina to drag this model along. Can you grab that and
sure.
put it up here?
Yeah. There we go. There we are.
Since what is it we're looking at?
This is our magic fault box.
The magic fault box.
So what we're looking at here, this is just a representation of different layers of the earth. So, you know, you can imagine this as if you see a road cut and you see different colored rocks, you know, in the side of the road cut. So they're deposited, and in geology we assume they're deposited horizontally, and for the most part that's true. And then you have different geologic events happen. In Washington we're getting compressed and squished, and we have the subduction zone that's, you know, a big player in this interaction. And so then you have folding that occurs. So these strata, these rocks get folded, and then sometimes if you look at a road cut, that's what you see. And then you have erosion. We have massive amounts of rain, we have landslides, we have things that happen, and so different layers get shed and pulled off, and so then you have less strata. And then we also have faults, and so I think if I'm doing it the right way, if I turn it that way to the camera. So we have thrust faults where you have compression, and you juxtapose or move these different layers of rock against each other. And then you have the fault line, which is where you see the break in these different rock types. And then if you think about eroding this top part again, you would see different rock units placed against one another.
And that's how we know what is happening.
And that's how we know what's happening. We see evidence for layers repeating themselves, and we can date, you know, we can know the age of one layer, and then we can date it below and say, hey, that's the same age. And then we scratch our heads and we think, okay, well, how did it get there? And if we can't find the fault, that's a surefire way to know that they were misplaced and there's something bigger going on here. And then we dig deeper and we can say, oh, there's a fault, or we can use the LiDAR and say, oh my gosh, look at that fault. And there's a great picture that you posted on your website of a splay of the Seattle fault across Bainbridge Island.
Right.
We call it the Toe Jam Hill fault. And it's incredible. You can just see the fault line running across the island. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. Different units juxtaposed, and you have uplifted parts and downdropped parts. And that's what causes this
And
tsunami.
this scenario is what the Seattle fault would give us.
Right.
Yeah, very simplified, but yes.
Highly simplified, realizing that, but at least it's like when it moves in parts of Bainbridge Island, uplifted, what, 20 feet?
Yeah.
They think
26
1,000 years
feet,
ago,
yeah.
26 feet.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's what could put a 7-meter wave into Elliott Bay if you had a repeat of that 1,100-year-old raised beach event that occurred in AD 900 here. So there's been, 1,100 years since that big Seattle fault earthquake. That's a lot of time for strain to accumulate, but these really big, devastating earthquakes, luckily, don't happen that frequently. So it could happen tomorrow because we've had 1,100 years of strain accumulation. But at the same time, this may be normally more of a 2,500-year event or something. And so there's a estimated 5% probability of seeing another one of these big earthquakes on the Seattle fault in the next 50 years, greater than 6.5, and lower probability than that of having another one of the raised beach events that would put the big wave in Elliott Bay. So it's something we have to consider, but it's certainly nothing you're going to plan your beach trip on, right? So it's one of those things. Altogether, for all these big faults in the Puget Lowland, there's about a 15% chance of a big earthquake in the next 15 years. And then another
15 years,
No, 50% in 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah, and then there's another 15% chance of a magnitude 9 offshore in the next 50 years, and an 84% chance of a big deep earthquake. So that's still kind of driving our hazard assessment a lot in the Puget Sound region, is that frequency of the big deep earthquakes, even though they tend to result in less damage than a big crustal or the subduction zone.
As I look at this model, I've never seen it explained this way. There's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of variation there. So predicting seems to be a really, really complex thing to do.
And my hat's off to the geologist in sorting all of these layers and this stuff off, because this is simplified, but they also move sideways and up, and they can move down and over, and depending on the tectonic setting and where this push and stress and strain is, and folding them at the same time. So it's amazing the work they do. And when I came to UW, no one had ever laid their hands on a crustal fault in the Puget Lowland, or in an active one of these big ones. And now we have 8 or 10 active faults identified, and more we strongly suspect, and investigations going on all the time to go out to these fault scarps that are discovered in the field, trench across them, find the bits of carbon or other datable material around the fault, to be able to find out when the fault moved, how much did it move, what magnitude earthquake was there. And the geologists are doing all of this. Seismologists have virtually nothing to do with this
So
kind of work.
let's segue to the geologist and wrap this thing up. Your final thoughts here.
Final thoughts are be curious, ask questions, go out and learn about the geology in your neighborhood and find out what your hazards are, where you live, work, and play, and try and prepare yourself and your family and your friends and your coworkers for the next event, because you're going to be in this together and you're not going to get help for a couple weeks, and you should try and be prepared. And it's not that hard, just a little bit at a time.
And then you're there before you know it.
Yeah. And, like I said, ask questions, be curious, and try and find out about what you need to know to make yourself safe.
I was born and raised on the East Coast. I've lived in different parts of California, and there's no place like the Seattle area. I mean, I just love living here. I love the region. I've been here for 30 years and raised my family. I love it, and part of the reason it's so beautiful and so dynamic is that we live near a fault boundary. And that's just part of the trade-off. If you live in Kansas, you got to be ready for tornadoes. If you live on the East Coast, you're going to get a hurricane now and again, right? we live in the most spectacularly beautiful part of the country, and we have earthquakes and volcanoes. So we have to learn how to live with them, but we can do that and really enjoy a wonderful life here and raise our families safely in the Pacific Northwest if we really face and recognize that these are hazards we have, and we have to do some things to protect ourselves.
I'll let you have the final word in just a sec. I'll tell you what has been fun for me this week, Glenn, is I've learned a lot. You know, you say be curious. Today, from your story on our newscast, I learned what I need to do with my gas meter in the event of an earthquake. If I don't smell gas, or if I don't hear a hissing sound, or if the meter's not spinning, I don't have to shut it off. But you showed me how to shut off the gas meter today. And there's that. And I also learned that my hot water tank is a great reservoir of drinking water in the event of an earthquake. And so lots of little things that we can all do just to be aware of, I think, is the step that we need to take first. Be aware of it, and then a little bit at a time, like you said, to be prepared. So thanks for all of you for the work that you're doing to get all of us prepared for the inevitable.
Well, and that's it. And then the question is, we don't know when. We're just talking about some of the odds, but the fact is, it will happen at some point. And in trying to be optimistic about this, and I think there is reason for optimism, if we keep pushing, if we keep building, if we keep retrofitting, doing all these things, if the scientists keep digging and coming up with more and more answers, then eventually I think we're going to get to where our resilience is going to be that much better. And the potential downside and the recovery and everything is going to go, the downside will be less, the recovery will be faster, and the getting back to normal to enjoy the state the way it is, we can get back to it just that much sooner.
All right.
That's right.
Well, I want to thank Glenn Farley, King 5 News, Karina Forson, Washington Geological Survey, and Bill Steele from the University of Washington. Thanks so much. It's been fun having you here and talking about this.
Thank you. We really appreciate you doing this.
And thanks to those of you who've joined us on the platforms of King 5. That's going to wrap it up for here, but we'll see you later. Thanks for joining us.
So what we're looking at here are earthquakes in the Puget Sound region since 1970.
There are thousands of dots from less than a magnitude 1 to a 6.8. That dot near Olympia is the epicenter of the February 2001 Nisqually quake. Magnitude 6.8. No one died as a direct result of the shaking, but the region saw billions in damage. For the most part, roads and buildings were back up and running quickly. But a 7.0 on the Seattle fault that doesn't seem to be much stronger by the numbers, but runs just south of downtown Seattle, promises to be far more devastating.
But the thing about it is where the Nisqually quake was 30 miles underground, this is right here.
Yes.
Here's the difference. This aerial LiDAR image recorded from an airplane strips away trees and vegetation to expose the earth below. And that line is the Seattle fault crossing Bainbridge Island, right on the surface, where Nisqually happened 30 miles underground.
This is Restoration Point. This area was uplifted 21 feet in the 900 AD earthquake.
That was over 1,000 years ago. And unlike the Cascadia subduction zone, which happens with regularity, give or take a few hundred years, geologists don't have any sense for the frequency of quakes in the Seattle fault, which is really a complex of faults on this map that likely tie together underground.
Additionally, you look at this and you go, I-90 pretty much runs right along the Seattle fault, and strands of it cross I-5 multiple times. So if you have bridges, if you have overpasses, all of our major lifelines can be disrupted from this earthquake as well.
The rocks basically go whoop.
USGS geologist Brian Sherrod even found exposed evidence of the fault under I-5, and he has dug trenches looking for evidence of just where this fault and others go. And there's more.
In this case, this is a thrust fault, and so it's undergoing compression, and when you have an earthquake, the fault slips and uplifts, and so this is kind of what we're looking at in these fault trenches.
That movement expected to force a localized tsunami, the wave threat no longer restricted to the coast. Seismologists expect low-lying land along the Seattle waterfront would be vulnerable, along with Harbor Island, much of the Soto district, and Inner Bay. It's also expected to travel north.
This is a tsunami hazard map of Everett, and so this is a result of the Seattle fault earthquake.
South Whidbey could be even bigger, a 7.5. Unlike the Seattle fault, there's a better sense for how many times it's gone off. Forson says 4 quakes over the last 16,000 years, but says we still need to know even more about them.
There's so much more work to be done, you know, within the basin and within all of Washington for understanding these faults and really analyzing the LIDAR and getting boots on the ground and doing detailed mapping.